Has anyone ever accused you of being too emotional just to dismiss your pain?
The night my sister sent me that text, the one that said dinner was for the successful ones, I sat there for a long time staring at it, not because the words were complicated, but because the message underneath them was so familiar. Almost like a family tradition by now. I wanted to tell myself it did not matter, that I had outgrown this kind of childish competition and exclusion, but the truth was it stung in a way I could not just brush off, because it pulled me straight back into every holiday, every birthday, and every graduation where Ava had been framed as the golden child while I was treated like an afterthought. I thought about answering with something cutting, something that would make her at least hesitate before pressing send so casually next time, but then I realized there was no point, because she never cared what I said anyway. She only cared about making sure I knew my place. So I closed the screen, but of course the thought did not close with it. I sat at my small kitchen table, picked up a sandwich I had made without really tasting it, and realized that the part that hurt the most was not even the dinner itself, but the way she felt so confident in writing it out like that. Certain that our parents would support her and not me, certain that I would swallow it because that is what I had always done. And maybe she was right in the past, but that night I was in the middle of something too big for her to understand, something she did not even know existed, and while she thought she was delivering the final word in another of her family victories, I was actually holding cards she could not even imagine. I thought about the years I had put into building my company, the months of sleeping on an office couch, the friends who drifted away because I was never available, and the countless awkward explanations to relatives who never really listened. They thought tech meant I was tinkering with computers like a hobby, while Ava's husband Evan with his mediocre marketing firm was praised for being business-minded and ambitious. Every time I heard that word tossed his way, I wanted to laugh, because what he ran was not ambition, it was a local gig with a glossy website. But he knew how to sell himself at family tables, and I never tried. So in their minds, he belonged in the successful category, and I did not. That night, instead of collapsing into frustration, I opened my laptop and scrolled through the final documents of the acquisition that had been consuming my life for months. The calls, the endless negotiations, the nights I doubted myself, it had all led to this binder, this one chance to turn everything around. I read through it line by line, feeling both exhausted and electrified. In a few hours, I was going to sign a deal that would push Northline Systems into the hands of an international partner, and the valuation was numbers so large that even saying them out loud sounded like fiction. My sister had no clue that the woman she thought was unworthy of family dinner was about to close a transaction that would be splashed across financial news networks before the night ended. I remember sitting there, phone buzzing on the table with group chat notifications I refused to open, and I actually smiled to myself for the first time that day. Not because of revenge yet, but because I knew the balance was about to flip in a way no one could ignore. All the years of dismissive comments, the smirks, the subtle digs about, still trying to make that little company work, they were about to evaporate in one headline. And I knew when it hit, the same people who had turned their backs on me would suddenly remember my number. But even as I thought about it, I also knew this could not just be about basking in attention. If I picked up those calls too quickly, if I gave them the satisfaction of thinking they could treat me like dirt one day and then ride my coattails the next, nothing would change. So I sat back and made a decision that surprised even me. I was not going to answer. Not that night, not the next morning, not until I decided what they really deserved. If Ava thought she was the gatekeeper of who counted as successful, I was about to remind her that gates swing both ways, and some of them can lock shut. By the time I finally closed the laptop and washed the single plate from my lonely dinner, my hurt had turned into a kind of quiet calculation. I knew they would all call soon, and when they did, I would not be the one waiting for permission anymore. I would be the one deciding who got through and who did not, and for once in my life, the decision would be mine entirely. I lay down that night thinking less about the sting of her text and more about the sound of silence that would meet her calls when the news broke. And that silence was going to say everything I never had to. The breaking news alert was only hours away, and none of them saw it coming. When the alert finally hit, it did not arrive with fireworks or some cinematic drumbeat. It was just a banner on my screen and a tone I had heard 1,000 times before, except this time the words under it were about my company and my name. And within a minute, the same relatives who had watched me be edited out of family dinners started lighting up my phone like I was a customer service desk for sudden pride. I let it ring, and I watched the names march across the screen in the exact order I expected. My mother first, because she wants to lay claim to any good thing. My father second, because he follows her lead. My sister third, because she needed to pretend she had always believed in me. And Evan right after, because a man like that hears opportunity the way a dog hears the fridge open. I did not pick up any of them, not because I wanted to be dramatic, but because I had waited years for the chance to choose silence and finally have it mean something. I opened my voicemail settings and wrote a message that felt almost surgical in its politeness, a short greeting that said I was in meetings for a few days, that I would return calls in the order that support had been shown, that urgent matters should be sent by text with specifics, and that family would be better served by scheduling time the same way my investors did if they wanted real conversations rather than a drive-by victory lap. I set it to auto-reply for any missed calls from numbers I flagged, and I flagged them all, one by one, so that the first thing they heard was not my voice, but the new reality, which was that Access had rules now and they were not the ones writing them. I could hear the pushback in my head before it even arrived, the way my mother would call the message cold and my sister would frame it as an overreaction, but there was a moment where I realized I did not care if they called me cold, because what they had called warm all these years was really just me being available for their convenience. I had never turned off my phone during holidays because what if they needed me to drive someone to the airport, or what if someone wanted me to help draft a resume or look at a pitch deck, yet when I needed an ear or a couch, there was always a reason it could not be them. That pattern was over, not in a loud dramatic way, but in the quiet way a door closes and a latch clicks. With the phone still buzzing, I forwarded the press link to exactly one person in the family, and that was Grandma Ruth, because she was the only one who had looked at me across years of failure and said, "Keep going, kid. Even if you have to do it with shaky hands." I sent her one line that said breakfast tomorrow, my treat, early, no other guests, and she sent back a heart made out of keyboard characters that she has been using since email was a new toy. I put the meeting on my calendar and I felt lighter, not because of the headline, oddly, but because I finally knew who I wanted to spend time with when something good happened. Then I opened a different window, the one that controlled the operational notices for the transition we were entering, and I reviewed a clause that had been debated for weeks and had finally landed right where I needed it. A clean exclusivity that disallowed ongoing vendor work for any firm that had a personal relationship with executive leadership on either side of the acquisition. That language had been about ethics and clean lines and avoiding conflicts of interest, but I would be lying if I said I had not thought about Evan when I pushed for it. He had been bragging at family tables for years about a client in our orbit, talking like he was untouchable because someone there owed him favors. And now his untouchable status looked a lot like a line in a contract that told him to wind down gracefully within a set number of days. I drafted the notice to the client contact, not because I wanted to gloat, but because I wanted the paperwork to move before the group chat turned into begging. I was careful and professional and wrote it in a tone that would look boring in discovery, the kind of sentence you have to read twice to feel anything at all, and then I hit send and marked it for delivery receipts. I did not need to imagine Evan's reaction because I knew him well enough to predict it, from smug to confused to angry to strategic, and finally to my sister texting me that we should talk as a family and not let business affect love. It sounded noble on paper, and it would have sounded better if love had ever made room for me at their table. My parents tried again and again, and I watched the calls stack like dominoes, and I felt the old guilt pull at me, because children of any age are trained to pick up when their mother calls, even when the mother makes a habit of calling only when there is a trophy to hold. I made tea and sat with the guilt long enough to see it clearly. When I had asked for help with rent in those first months, they had sent a long message about responsibility while buying my sister a new car because her lease terms were annoying, and when I had needed 2 nights on their couch after a flood in my apartment. I had received a lecture about boundaries while my sister's dog was given its own guest room. None of that was a crime, but it was a pattern, and patterns were the only honest map of how people value you. So I let the tea steam and I wrote out a plan on a notepad, a list of names and the access each one had earned. Some would get breakfast, some would get a call back next week, some would get a polite text that said congratulations are appreciated and conversations can wait. At the very bottom, I wrote Ava and underlined it twice, not because I was angry, but because I wanted to sit with how it felt to say no without apology. I had always dreamed that one day she would see me clearly and maybe even regret how she had behaved, but I finally understood that clarity did not travel that direction. It had to be mine first. Around midnight, the first text from Ava arrived, a fast, breathless message pretending she had not meant her dinner comment the way it sounded, and that we should laugh about it because look at this crazy headline. And did I want to come by for dessert because everyone was asking about me? I looked at the words and I thought about all the times I had been invited last and praised in the past tense, and I typed a reply that was neither cruel nor forgiving. I wrote that I would not be coming by, that my schedule was packed, and that future dinners would be by invitation only with a focus on the people who had been present when the cameras were not. I sent it, I set the phone face down, and I felt that tiny internal click again, the one that told me I was finally steering my own car. By morning, the legal receipt landed confirming that the wind-down notice had been delivered, and my voicemail rule had caught 3 long messages from Evan escalating in tone from cheerful to confused to urgent. I played the first second of each and then deleted them because I did not need to hear his strategizing. I had already made my move, and it was clean, precise, and backed by policy. I put on clothes that did not try to tell a story and left for breakfast early, because Grandma does not like to wait in crowded places, and because I wanted to look her in the eye and thank her for being the only person who never asked me to prove I was worth a chair. And as I stepped out the door, my phone buzzed again with another call from home, and I let it die in my pocket because the next voice I wanted to hear belonged to the only person in the family who had earned more than a headline. By the time the weekend settled in, the story had already run its course across every business network that liked dramatic numbers and female founders, and my name had been mentioned more times in 2 days than it had been in 30 years of family gatherings. Yet the people who once could not be bothered to ask me a single question about what I was building were suddenly acting like I owed them a press briefing. I knew if I let myself get dragged into their cycle of calls and explanations, I would hand back the power I had only just taken, so I decided to hold my line, and instead of chasing their approval like I used to, I spent my time looking at the list I had drawn up and asking myself who in my life had actually shown up when there were no headlines attached. That list was embarrassingly short, but it was also clear, and clarity is something I had lived without for too long. Grandma Ruth had her breakfast, of course, and she told me in her usual blunt way that she was proud, but more importantly, she said she was relieved, because she had worried all those nights when I looked exhausted at family holidays and pretended I was fine. And she confessed she had known I was carrying something bigger than anyone else could see. I told her she had been the only one who believed without proof, and she brushed it off like belief was free, and I should not thank her for giving something that should have been a given. But I still thanked her because being the only voice that does not ask for receipts is not free, it costs patience, and she had paid it in full. When I left that breakfast, I thought about the times in the past when I had been so desperate for acknowledgement that I would bring small successes to the table like offerings, showing them press clippings from niche magazines or a graph of early growth, only to watch their eyes glaze over while they turned back to Ava and Evan to ask about vacation homes and car upgrades. That pattern was burned into me so deeply that even as the headlines now shouted a number they could not ignore, I still caught myself waiting for someone to dismiss it. But no one dismissed it because numbers that big silence even the loudest critics, and instead of dismissal I got desperation. Ava's next message was almost comical in how quickly she pivoted from smug exclusion to begging for a seat at the table she had once barred me from. She wrote that she had been misunderstood, that she had only been joking about dinner, that I was too sensitive, that what really mattered was family sticking together when things got big, because who else could I trust if not blood? Reading it felt like walking through a museum of excuses, each framed carefully, but all saying the same thing. She was losing her grip on the status she had spent years curating. And woven through her words, I could see Evan's fingerprints, because suddenly she was bringing up business opportunities, insisting that this was a chance for all of us to align, a word that sounds cooperative until you realize it really means, let me latch onto your hard work before it leaves me behind. I did not respond right away, but I also did not ignore her, because part of me wanted her to feel that hope of a meeting before I set the terms. So I sent back a brief note that we could meet in person if she brought Evan, that I had conditions for the conversation, and that I expected respect to be mutual or it would be the last meeting we ever had. I worded it deliberately like a business email, stripped of family language, so she would understand that the world she had mocked me for living in was now the world setting her boundaries. The next morning, she agreed instantly, which only confirmed what I already knew, that this was about survival for them, not reconciliation. While waiting for that meeting, I moved on to something that had been sitting in the back of my mind for years. My parents had always celebrated donations or scholarships that carried the family name, usually funded by Ava's in-laws or other relatives with more interest in prestige than generosity. And they would brag endlessly about plaques on walls that declared our family's legacy. I had hated that word because legacies built on exclusion are just monuments to ego, but now I had the resources to redirect it. I contacted the university where I had once begged for lab space, where I had been denied access because I did not have the right introductions, and I arranged for a fellowship in computer science dedicated entirely in Grandma Ruth's name. No family last name attached, no plaque linking it to those who ignored me, just her name in bold letters as the sponsor of something that would outlast every shallow dinner toast they had ever given. When the paperwork was finalized, I sat with the confirmation email open, and I felt a deep sense of justice, because while Ava and Evan were scrambling to hold on to a contract that was slipping through their fingers, the only person who had ever handed me a sandwich in silence during a night of coding was now permanently honored in a place that had once shut its doors to me. It was not revenge in the traditional sense, but it was a correction, and corrections often hurt more than attacks because they force people to see what could have been if they had acted differently. Of course, news of that fellowship traveled fast once the announcement went public, and my parents called 3 times in 1 hour, furious that they had not been consulted, insisting that legacies should be shared. I let their calls go unanswered, because the truth was I had no interest in sharing this one. It belonged to the only person who had shared with me when I had nothing. The irony was perfect. The same relatives who thought dinners were for the successful ones were now watching the only family name they cared about erased from a wall that actually mattered, replaced by the one person they had underestimated. By the end of that weekend, Ava sent another frantic message asking if we could meet sooner rather than later, because Evan's largest client had just received notice that his contract would not be renewed under the acquisition terms, and apparently word had already gotten back to him that my fingerprints were on that decision. She wanted to believe she could appeal to me as her sister, but the truth was she was about to walk into a conversation where sisterhood had no currency left. And when I agreed to a meeting, I knew it would not be about reconciling or healing old wounds. It would be about terms, and this time I would be the one writing them. When the day of the meeting arrived, I was not nervous in the way I used to be whenever I walked into a room with my sister, because in the past every encounter with her had been defined by her ability to control the atmosphere with her cutting little jokes and that effortless confidence that comes from knowing everyone else in the family will back you no matter how petty you behave. But this time the balance had shifted so completely that I found myself almost detached, as if I were the one hosting them rather than the other way around. I chose a neutral office space rather than a restaurant or a house, partly because I wanted them to feel the sterile seriousness of business instead of the familiarity of family, and partly because I wanted to see if they could manage a conversation without leaning on the crutch of tradition and obligation. They arrived late, which was predictable, since Ava always believed arriving a few minutes past the agreed time was a way to show that she was important, but instead of reacting with the usual irritation, I simply looked at my watch, made a note, and continued reading a report while they settled into their chairs. The silence that stretched between us was different this time. It was not the silence of me waiting for their approval, but the silence of them realizing they had walked into my space and were now operating on my rules. I could see Evan trying to muster his professional charm, but the strain was obvious, his smile too quick and his eyes darting in a way that betrayed just how much this meeting mattered to him. I began with simple clarity. The acquisition had triggered clauses that required certain contracts to end. His was among them, and while the transition would be orderly and respectful, it was not optional. I explained that I had been transparent in negotiations, that everything was legally sound, and that there was no room for appeals. He opened his mouth to argue, but I raised my hand slightly and told him I had not invited them to debate the contract. I had invited them to discuss whether there was any possible future relationship between us at all, personal or professional, and if so, what it would require. That statement landed heavier than any raised voice could have, because for the first time Ava understood that the gate she had so confidently guarded for years was now in my hands, and entry was conditional. I laid out the terms as plainly as possible. If they wanted to move forward with any kind of relationship, there would have to be acknowledgement of the years of exclusion and dismissal, written down in a letter that was not for me but for themselves. A kind of permanent receipt that they could not later rewrite or downplay. In addition, Evan would need to repay a loan I had given him years ago, a small amount compared to what he was losing now, but a debt he had conveniently forgotten while bragging about his supposed success. It was not about the money, it was about the principle, and I told him that settling that debt would be the only signal I could take seriously that he was willing to treat me as someone whose contributions mattered. The reaction was exactly what I expected. Ava scoffed, calling it childish to demand apologies and repayment when I had already won, and Evan tried to reframe the entire thing as a misunderstanding, suggesting that we were all family and should not let old wounds get in the way of bigger opportunities. I listened without interruption, because there was nothing new in their words, only the same recycled excuses they had always used to justify treating me like a background character in my own life. When they finished, I told them calmly that if they could not meet the terms, then this would be our last meaningful conversation, because I no longer had space for relationships built on convenience and amnesia. Ava tried to pull our parents into the conversation indirectly, hinting that they were worried and upset about the distance growing between us, but I cut her off before she could weaponize them. I said plainly that our parents had already made their choices long ago, siding with her whenever she needed support, dismissing me whenever I asked for the smallest acknowledgement, and that while I did not hold resentment anymore, I also no longer felt bound by their opinion. That was the first time I had ever said it aloud, and I could see her mouth actually freeze, because for once she had no quick retort. By the end of the meeting, nothing was agreed upon, because they refused to give me what I asked for, and I refused to bend. We stood, exchanged stiff goodbyes, and I walked out before they could pretend to soften things with fake warmth. I did not feel triumphant, but I felt solid, which was more valuable. On the way back to my office, I began drafting the guest list for a private dinner I was planning with close friends, colleagues, and the handful of relatives who had quietly supported me. I gave the dinner a working title in the invitation system, for the successful ones, because if Ava wanted to play gatekeeper, I wanted her to understand that the lock had been changed permanently. When the invitations went out the next morning, I knew word would spread fast, and I knew she would hear the title and realize it was a direct mirror of her own message. It was not cruel, it was precise, a reminder that words have weight when you use them to push someone down, because sometimes they come back with a force you cannot dodge. As the confirmations rolled in from people I respected, people who had been there without needing proof of headlines, I felt something I had never felt before in relation to my family, peace in the decision to exclude them. And as the dinner date approached, I could sense the panic growing on their end, not because they were hungry for food, but because they were starving for access. What none of them knew yet was that the real shift had already been sealed, and that the upcoming dinner was not just a celebration, but a signal of what was about to be revealed, a final decision I had made long before the acquisition closed. One that would determine exactly who had a place in my future and who was going to be permanently left outside the window, staring in at what they had thrown away. The night of the dinner arrived with a kind of nervous energy that in the past would have sent me spiraling into second-guessing, because I would have worried about who was seated where and whether I had done enough to make everyone comfortable. Yet as I stood at the entrance and watched people file in, engineers who had stayed late for years without complaining, an early customer who had trusted my product when it still wobbled, two former interns who had become my best operators, and Grandma Ruth moving slowly, but with that stubborn light in her eyes, I realized I did not care about pleasing anyone anymore. I cared about honoring the ones who had carried pieces of the weight when I could not lift it alone. And that change in priority snapped into place so cleanly that I almost laughed at how long it had taken me to reach something so obvious. I kept the room simple because I wanted the conversation to be the show, and when the plates were set down and the noise settled into that soft hum that comes right before a toast, I tapped my glass and said exactly what I needed to say without dressing it up, which was that access is not an inheritance and it is not a birthright, it is a responsibility, and if you do not handle it with care you will lose it, and if you use it as a weapon you will learn that the same door that lets you in can also shut you out for good. I thanked people by name. I did not recite numbers, and when I reached Grandma Ruth, I told the room she was the only person in my family who could call me at any hour and know I would pick up, because trust is measured in what you do when no one is watching, not in the way you crowd around a headline after it already belongs to me. The applause was warm and kind, and I saw a few people glance toward the entrance as if they expected my sister to crash the thing with a dramatic apology, but she did not appear, and honestly, even if she had, the script had already moved past her. What I had not said in the toast, and what I now signaled to the operations lead with a nod, was the final move that had been waiting behind the curtain for a week, a move that would not feel loud to outsiders, but would redraw the map of who stood where in my life. Months ago, when the deal reached the stage where everyone begins to count winnings that are not yet in the bank, I had asked counsel to prepare a Friends and Allies participation pool that opened for a very short window before any public notice could ignite the usual feeding frenzy, and the rule was blunt and unromantic. The list would be populated only by people who showed verifiable support during a set of years when support had a real cost, which meant time, introductions, thoughtful feedback, or quiet loyalty when failure looked more likely than success. There would be no retroactive additions, no edits based on last-minute charm, and absolutely no substitutions dressed up as family obligations, because if you needed a breaking news report to remember my number, you did not qualify. The lead rolled in a small cart with envelopes labeled in pen, and for a second I felt the urge to defend myself, to explain that I was not trying to be cruel, that I was trying to be fair, but then I let the urge fade. Because fairness often looks harsh to people who have lived for years inside an arrangement that always tilted their way. One by one, I handed those envelopes to the people whose names were on them, and inside each was a letter on plain paper explaining that a pre-closing allocation had granted them a quiet slice of upside, already vested and already valued, with no hoops to jump through and no performance games attached, because their performance had already happened in the dark. The room did not erupt, because the people who received them understood in their bones that this was not a lottery ticket, it was a receipt for something they had already paid, and that recognition, that soft exhale of yes, this is right, reached me deeper than any cheer could have. I gave Grandma Ruth her envelope last, and she chuckled at the formality even as her hands shook a little, and she whispered that she did not need it, which is exactly why she deserved it, and when she asked if I was sure, I told her that certainty was the first thing I had promised myself when I decided to stop letting other people translate my worth for me. Then, because I am still a human being who knows how to savor a clean hit, I asked the coordinator to go ahead with the second part of the plan, a small communications drop scheduled for the next morning that would make everything unambiguous. A short public note about the fellowship in her name, a summary of the community grants for the Women in Tech program we had seeded quietly during due diligence, and a simple line that the founder dinner was private, by invitation, and not affiliated with any broader family celebration. I went home without checking my phone because I did not need to guess what was waiting there. I could already feel the push and the pull of it. The combination of performative concern and outright accusation that always follows a woman who refuses to apologize for drawing a boundary. When I finally turned it on in the morning, the messages were exactly what you would expect. My mother scolding me for embarrassing the family by excluding my sister, my father suggesting I should be the bigger person. As if growth is measured in how much disrespect you can absorb without flinching, Ava asking if the dinner title had been a jab or a joke or both, and Evan skipping straight to the point by proposing a fresh start. That suspiciously looked like the old arrangement where he eats first and everyone else cleans the dishes. I read them all without reacting, and then I sent 3 messages that I had drafted in my head for years. To my parents, I wrote that I loved them, but that love was not a coupon for access, and that any future relationship would require them to treat me like an adult whose time and boundaries are real, and until that happened, I would be stepping back. To Evan, I sent a single sentence confirming that the wind-down timeline was final and that any attempt to route work through affiliates would jeopardize his reputation with people who read contracts more carefully than he reads dinner menus. And to Ava, I wrote the only honest thing left to say, which was that she had made a choice when she texted that dinner was for the successful ones, and I had made a choice when I let the calls ring, and if she wanted to start over, she could put something truthful in writing and repay the small debt we both knew she owed, not because the money mattered, but because accountability does, and if she could not do that, then silence would be the cleanest ending we were going to get. I pressed send, set the phone down, and waited for the familiar wave of guilt that used to follow any act of self-respect, and when it did not arrive, I understood that the plan had not only worked in the world outside my skin, it had worked inside me too. The fellowship letters went out at noon with Grandma Ruth's name in the headline. The participation pool confirmations finalized in the afternoon without a single leak, and by evening the group chat that once made me dread holidays had gone quiet. Because there is not much to say when the person you underestimated stops asking for a seat and builds a room you cannot enter. I made dinner at home and ate it with my laptop closed and my phone in another room, and while I could have watched clips about the deal and scrolled through congratulations, I chose to do something I had not done since I was a kid after a long swim lesson, which was to enjoy the kind of tired that feels like completion rather than defeat. If there is a moral here, it is not one I am interested in preaching, because this did not happen to teach anyone a lesson about kindness or patience. It happened because I finally stopped negotiating with people who enjoyed watching me beg. The truth they will circle around for years is simple. I did not punish them. I just removed the illusion that they were entitled to me, and once the illusion was gone, their behavior looked exactly like what it had always been. I am not sure if Ava will ever write the letter or repay the debt, and I am not sure if my parents will ever meet me on adult ground, but I am sure that none of those decisions will determine whether I sleep at night. Because the final move was never about getting them to change, it was about proving to myself that I could. And as endings go, that one does not look flashy, but it is the kind you can live inside without apology, which is what I wanted the whole time, even back when I thought a single family dinner could tell me who I was.